Welcome back to Bay's Bible. We are in the season of Epiphany. If you've not had a chance to check out our previous episodes, I highly encourage you to visit our channel's page and to catch up on the previous episodes, as well as hit the subscribe button down below so that you'll get updates as to when the new episodes come out. Our overall short lesson for the season of Epiphany has been, Epiphany is about witnessing and becoming witnesses to Christ's divine glory. Now, we have been on a journey of exploring various aspects of the rich variety of ways that God's glory shines in the world. And while the number of ways that God's glory shines in the world are as numerous as the number of movies that Nicolas Cage has been in, we have been exploring over the past 3 weeks how God's glory shines in the world through three particular aspects. One, how God is our Savior from calamity. Two, how God is acting as our authoritative voice of truth. And in this week, we're going to see how God is our sustainer throughout our lives. Now, to get a little bit of a better idea of what sustaining grace is really all about, we can think about the ways that we become rejuvenated. Yes, I did that once. And rejuvenation is very different than rest, because when we normally think of resting, we think of taking breaks from our normal routines and then binging a TV show or eating junk food. And while rest, a break from our normal activities, is really important, often the practices and the things that we do during our period of rest, they're not particularly rejuvenating. They don't give us new life. They don't give us new strength. They don't give us renewal to continue our work in the following week. So, how can we think about sustaining grace? Well, let me give you an example from my own life. When the COVID-19 lockdowns happened last March, last March, that's how long it's been, I was given an enormous opportunity to take a rest, to take a break from my normal activity of life. And my normal activity of life before the lockdowns was essentially living in 5 different places across the city of Toronto, doing 65 to 80-hour work weeks, swimming in stress like a fish in water. Now, while the COVID-19 lockdowns gave me a great chance to rest from my regular routine, I also, during that period, adopted new habits, new practices that were rejuvenating, such as diet, exercise, and even creative endeavors like here at Bay's Bible. Well, it is my hope and prayer for you that you will discover not only chances to rest from your regular activities, but that you will find in God your renewed source of strength and life as you continue in your journey with Him. Have you ever been mentally exhausted from holding particular viewpoints that everyone around you and every other source of information that you have suggests otherwise? Donald E. Gowan, in his book, The Theology of the Prophetic Books, Death and Resurrection of Israel, ascribes this kind of cognitive exhaustion to the Judeans in exile in Babylon in the 6th century BCE, which is the setting for chapters 40 to 66 of the book of the prophet Isaiah. And Gowan draws upon the sociologist Peter Berger to describe these Judeans in this situation, holding on to their faith in the God of Israel, as a cognitive minority. As we previously covered in the season of Advent, the Judeans in exile in the 6th century BCE had no reason to think anything other than Yahweh has lost. And in this situation, the sociologist Peter Berger says that cognitive minorities have 3 options. 1, they can surrender. They can just admit, I'm wrong, let's go back. 2, they can defy. They can say, no, I'm going to hold on to this no matter what everyone else says. Or 3, they can bargain. They could say, okay, there's some beliefs we're going to hold on to, but other ones we'll give up to try to ameliorate ourselves to the present cultural climate. Going back to Judeans in Babylon, how can these three options manifest themselves? Well, the Judeans could just surrender. They could just say, okay, guys, we're never going home. Let's become Babylonians. Let's stop circumcising our children. Let's stop practicing the Sabbath, and let's enjoy these pagan orgies. 2, they could bargain, which basically means to syncretize their religion with their surrounding culture, so that they hold on to some things, like maybe they'll still practice the Sabbath, but perhaps something like Passover, they might just keep a little bit more low-key. But in the face of both of these options, the prophet Isaiah says, forget all of that. And you can supply, instead of forget, another F word if you want. Isaiah defies all this. He says to the people that are saying in verse 27, oh, God's forgotten us. Oh, we're never going home. Oh, maybe God's against us now. Isaiah says, no. You're going to hold on to what you believe, even in the face of all these people that might be telling you that you're Babylophobic or that you are covenantal justice soldiers. You hold on to the faith in the God of Israel. You defy these circumstances of being a cognitive minority. And he goes straight on the offensive. He says basically in verse 26, look above your present circumstances. Look at where you're really at. Look above where you seem to be at the moment. Keep in mind who God is. If you believe that God has set up the entire universe like a tent with an inflatable mattress, don't you think he remembered to pack food? So Isaiah basically says, God does not faint. He does not grow weary. And as we see in verse 29, Isaiah basically says that God is going to give you of his own strength, of his own power to keep you up in the journey. So this Epiphany, when we see God acting as our sustainer, we are reminded to lift our minds beyond our present circumstances and to draw upon God's own strength as our source of renewal. Our psalmist reminds us that not only does God regard the powerful as belly-lint and intend to keep up the strength of his people, but that if God's strength is truly inexhaustible, then he can also care for those on the margins and even the smallest blade of grass. Now, the notion of God as the universal caregiver of everything might not be a concept that we can immediately grasp in our own minds, because we as human beings have limited emotional tanks. We might care about our families, our coworkers, our friends, maybe our pets. But if we see one more person asking us to have compassion for and to care about the needy masses on another continent somewhere, we might feel really bad because we may want to be compassionate, but we just can't have the same amount of care for those people we've never met as for those that are most immediate and proximate to us. For instance, in my own life, I can tell you, I care a lot more about student debt, gentrification of my neighborhood, and gender relations than I do about, genocide in China, or the stock market, or buying a car. And the reason is that student debt, gentrification of my neighborhood, and gender relations are way more proximate to me than the possible opportunity of buying a car one day or genocide in China. But when we are told that God has named the stars, I can't even remember the names of everyone in my parish, let alone the stars. This is unfathomably empathetic with all of creation. Now, St. Augustine makes an amazing statement in his biography, Confessions, about how God cares for us. You are good and all-powerful, caring for each one of us as though the only one in your care, and yet for all as for each individual. That is what we call in hip-hop hot fire. That is hot fire from St. Augustine right there, okay? Now, of last to note for our psalm, we need to turn to actually St. Augustine's homily on this psalm in order to pick up a really important detail that he makes about verse 3. When St. Augustine turns his attention to verse 3 of our psalm, he asks who the brokenhearted are and what is the means by which God binds up their wounds. And St. Augustine points our attention to possibly one of the very few places in the Hebrew Bible elsewhere where the brokenhearted are mentioned. And this is in Psalm 51. A broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. The brokenhearted are those who feel guilty for their sins and are seeking redemption. So then St. Augustine says, okay, that those who are the brokenhearted are, how does God bind up their wounds? What are the means whereby he binds? The sacraments of this present life, whereby in the meantime we obtain our comfort. In Epiphany then, as we see God's care for each and every single one of us, we are to sing God's praises for such care and to receive his care in the sacraments of his church. St. Paul, after last week's passage, spends much of chapter 9 of his first letter to the Corinthians basically telling them, but don't get it twisted. Think of that friend of yours who is more than happy to leave the decision to you as to where you're going to decide to eat. Now, it's great to have people in your life that go with the flow. That they are not the leaders, they're the followers, they are obligers, they're the foot soldiers. Those people are very important. But for people who are like that, who have that disposition in life, it's very important for you to hear that you don't get taken advantage of. And this is kind of what St. Paul does throughout much of chapter 9 in his first letter to the Corinthians. St. Paul basically says, yes, I'm single because that makes me freer to do my mission. Yes, I refrain from meat so as to not offend other Christians. But don't you forget, I'm an apostle. I saw Jesus Christ. If I wanted to get married, if I wanted to eat meat, and especially if I wanted to get paid for the ministry that I was doing, I'd be fully in my rights as an apostle to do so and demand it. Here St. Paul is kind of sticking up for himself. And, you might think that he's kind of full of himself here, or he's really, really overly confident. But what we soon discover about St. Paul is that he's just a man who is so in love with what he feels that he is obliged to do, that doing it is enough of a reward for him. In the cult classic sitcom Community, there's a character named Abed, and the rest of his peers in the show try to persuade him to change his mannerisms so that he can attract a girlfriend. And because they want him to be happy, so they think that if he can attract a girlfriend, he would be happy, but he can only do that if he changes his mannerisms. And he does so, but in the wake of the failure of their plan of him to attract a girlfriend, they are worried that they've hurt his self-esteem. To which Abed says, I've got self-esteem falling out of my butt. That's why I was willing to change for you guys. Because when you really know who you are and what you like about yourself, changing for other people isn't such a big deal. Like Abed, St. Paul has such self-assuredness in who he is in Christ and that he has been called to be an apostle. Such self-assuredness that it falls out of his butt, basically, that he can be Jewish or he can be Gentile and he can flip those lifestyles on a dime in full sincerity. And he's not being wishy-washy. He's not just taking whatever position is most expedient for him because he's not trying to ingratiate himself to particular people. N.T. Wright, in his now famous 2-volume work, Paul and the Faithfulness of God, says this about St. Paul here in our passage. St. Paul did not say, "I've become some things to some people, so that by some means I may be inoffensive and inclusive to all." Political manipulation, flip-flopping on issues in order to get the new crowd, that's not what St. Paul is doing here. No, St. Paul is enslaving himself to those he is trying to serve, modeled on Jesus. In a 4th century commentary that we have on Paul's letters by someone who we have named now Ambrosiaster, we can see how St. Paul's care and his ability to change his lifestyle is reflective of God's glory in caring for us. This is what Ambrosiaster has to say about our passage. Paul was a man of God and a doctor of the Spirit, who could diagnose every pain, and with great diligence he tended them and sympathized with them all. We all have something or other in common with everyone. This empathy is what Paul embodied in dealing with each particular person. In Epiphany, then, as we see God as the universal caregiver, we are given St. Paul as an example in terms of how to imitate God's own empathy for everything and how we can empathize with anyone for the sake of the gospel. When we were in the Gospel of Mark last week, we had a fairly intense episode of an exorcism. Well, immediately after this intense scene, Mark takes us to a much more private setting with Jesus and his new recruits. And already here, in verse 31, we have an echo of our passage from Isaiah, for Simon's mother-in-law is literally lifted up by God himself. She is running and not weary, walking and not faint. Now, in order to understand the full import of what's happening here, John Dominic Crossan, who is a New Testament scholar that is very idiosyncratic, meaning not a lot of people agree with him on very much of anything. Well, after that advertisement, he says in his book, Jesus, a Revolutionary Biography, he draws our attention to a distinction in medical anthropology that's very important between curing a disease and healing an illness. Now, curing a disease is a simple biomedical problem, like having a virus and need to come up with a vaccine. Whereas healing an illness is erasing the shame and stigma of having a disease or formerly having such a disease. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, our best example of this really was the AIDS-HIV virus, in which we had just myriads of people infected by this terrible virus. And while we do not yet have a cure for it, we have done a lot as a society to erase the shame and stigma of having HIV/AIDS. But now, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic, we can see that there is a big difference between, curing a fever, which is great, but also healing the illness of the social isolation, the shame, the fear of contamination that everyone was experiencing. There's a lot of work to be done in healing that illness among us. Well, so here too, Jesus, while he is the creator of the universe and thus can cure the disease as no one else can and provide that strength like God in Isaiah, he also heals the illness by bringing these people back into community, by reintegrating them into the larger social fabric, by not identifying them simply by what disease they've had or formerly had. But now here's the cool thing about our lectionary, because the lectionary frames our passage to move us beyond this initial scene to something that, while it occurs quite frequently in the Gospels, is still remarkably astonishing when we see Jesus himself going out to pray. Now here's why this is astonishing. If you were with us for our time during Advent, we explored how Jesus is God in the flesh. That is, God has become incarnate in Jesus. So when Jesus goes out to pray, this is God himself praying. Now, while in his divine nature, Jesus does not grow tired or grow weary. Christ is also taking on our human nature, which does grow tired and does grow weary and is in need of replenishing. And you can imagine that after such a long day of having this intense scene of an exorcism, then just wanting to chill at his friend's house while taking care of his mom, suddenly has this flood of people come to him that he's just incredibly, in human terms, probably quite tired. Probably hasn't even had time to have a nap. I know for myself that as much as I enjoy doing this Base Bible channel, that sometimes I need to rest from it, right? I need to break from the normal activities because it's just too much. And I'm sure that Jesus experienced those same things in his human nature. But what does Jesus do? Jesus goes off by himself to go pray to the Father. Now, why does he need to do this? Because I thought Jesus was God himself. Well, Jesus is showing us as human beings what we should do when we are tired and exhausted. Now, I don't know about you, but sometimes I'm too tired and inattentive to pray. But it is actually in prayer, when we come to God in prayer, that we receive his strength and his sustenance for us to continue about our lives. And Jesus has shown us that in his own praying, that we are no less exempt from reconnecting with the Father in our trials and tribulations. So in this season of Epiphany, as we see the glory of God as our caregiver, we are lastly given the example of God himself in the person of Christ Jesus, praying, showing us that as human beings, we need to draw upon God's strength in prayer. Well, that's all for us this week, folks. Thanks so much for coming to Base Bible again week after week. Next week will be our last week of the season of Epiphany, and we really enjoyed having everyone here. Please hit the subscribe button down below if you have not done so already, and please share these videos. Sharing them does an amazing amount to expand the audience of the channel. I would really, really appreciate it if people shared it, even with just one friend that you thought might really enjoy this. Our overall short lesson for the season of Epiphany has been, Epiphany is about witnessing and becoming witnesses to Christ's divine glory. And in this week, we've seen how that divine glory acts in the world as our sustainer throughout our lives. And our passages have shown us 4 ways into how we can receive this sustaining grace. Lift up our minds beyond our circumstances. Sing songs of praise and receive his care in the sacraments. Imitating God's empathy and care for the sake of the gospel. And finally, draw on God's strength in prayer as Christ did. Thanks everyone for coming again. We'll see you here again next week. Be sure to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. You already know the deal. If you've been watching us for a long time, please consider becoming a Patreon member. And thanks again. Blessings to you. We'll see you next week.